So it's been 4 months since I put together my first batch of compost, and I think I'm done. I mean, check it out. I've got this 5-gallon bucket full of compost. I've actually got probably 3 or 4 more 5-gallon buckets worth of dirt that I've put together, that I've created. So that's really great. And in this video, I want to share a few things that I've learned along the way. Let's get into the first one. The first thing that I learned was trying to understand, how do you know when you're done? They say compost can take anywhere from maybe 2 to 3 months to 6 months or more. I'm just shy of 4 months, and this is the result that I have right now. It's not quite the black gold that you see online, but if you smell it, it smells like earth. So it's got a very pleasant sort of garden smell to it, very earthy smell to it. So that's one indication to know that this compost, even though it doesn't look as dark or as black as I might expect, I do think it's done from I guess at the very least, a smell test. But also I wanted to produce or try another test, which is to actually plant a seed in the soil and see what happens. And that's what I've done as well. I planted this little bean plant. I planted this about a week ago, and this thing's just shooting up. And I just filled this pot full of the compost that I had put together, or that I composted. And as you can see, this compost is sustaining life, and this thing is just taking off. This thing is growing very quickly. It's kind of fun to watch this happen. But the earthy smell and the fact that it's growing an actual plant tells me that I'm probably done with this batch, and just gives me the general sense of I can move on to the next batch of compost. The second thing that I learned is I created a fairly bad ant problem for us at our home. So the compost bin that I put together was basically a box on the ground. I put it up right next to our house, a corner on the outside of our house. It was right up against a wall, an interior wall. On the other side of that wall was our food pantry, and within let's say a month to 2 months, it was very clear we had an ant problem. I exterminated the ants and just kept feeding the compost bin all the while, and our ant problem kept growing. And eventually it got to a point about 2 weeks ago where we had several different areas within our main floor around our kitchen where we had ants, and we had never had an ant problem this bad before. And I'm fairly certain it's because I kept feeding our compost pile a steady supply of fruit and vegetable scraps that sustained, or at least attracted, ants to our home, and they found some way in and moved around. So big lesson learned for me is, for subsequent batches of compost, I'm moving that pile further away from the house so that we don't have as much of an ant problem. So good takeaway for all of you: if you're going to have a compost pile, don't put it next to your house. Don't do what I did, unless you like killing ants on a daily basis, because it's not very fun. Another thing I learned is I should have bought a tumbler at the very beginning. With the first compost bin that I put together, I expressed some disbelief that you need to spend really any large amount of money on a tumbler or any fancy device. I mean, you basically need a box that you can just set off to the side and let the sun hit it and let it do its thing. What I had done was I had a pallet, I took it apart, I reconstructed it in the shape of a box, put it into the ground, and there it was. A very cheap solution to a compost bin. What that didn't allow me to do was several things. One is, when I saw that it was creating an ant problem, I can't exactly just move this box that's in the ground over and away from the home. Whereas with something like a tumbler, you can. Another sort of lesson learned on this front is I had purchased this tool more or less as an impulse buy, because I thought, well, if I got this thing in the ground, this looks like it'd be a good way to kind of toss up the dirt and just create air and aerate the actual compost pile. And while that's true, this tool did work well for that purpose. I mean, it's got no range on it. I'd have to be hunched over or on my hands and knees trying to do that. So I used this for probably, I don't know, a week or two before I was like, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm gonna get a tool with some range. And so I ended up going to a rake where I could actually, from a standing position, rake up the pile and aerate the compost pile. So that worked pretty well, except for times where you kind of get too aggressive and overtop the bin, and now you've kind of leaked your compost batch outside into the bin. All these little pain points are mitigated by a tumbler, and this is why spending $60 to $100 on a tumbler is worth it for me, and why I ultimately ended up buying a tumbler for my next few batches of compost. A tumbler is, something that can spin above ground, and it's mobile. So when there's an ant problem, if you detect an ant problem, you can move the tumbler away. That's a great benefit. The fact that you can spin the tumbler 2 or 3 times to aerate it, as opposed to raking it to introduce that air, that's also a great benefit. This specific tumbler that I bought has a divider in it, so that in one half of it I can have basically a compost pile that's just composting. I don't want to add any more to it and just spend a few more weeks letting that compost. Whereas on the other half, I can add more scraps to it and more sawdust to it and just sort of rotate back and forth. So again, last time I expressed some disbelief that something like a tumbler was a good investment. I'm fully willing to retract that opinion now and say a tumbler's worth it if you can afford it. If you can't, building your own box is still a fine option. You just have to do a little bit more manual labor to keep that compost pile healthy. The final lesson learned, or the final thing that I learned, is surface area matters. And I kind of already knew this, but I didn't always apply it. Anything that didn't have a lot of relative surface area didn't compost well. So here's an example. These are a few wood scraps that I have for my compost pile. And you can see they basically look like wood scraps. They just look like they've weathered or aged a bit, but they are more or less the same shape as when I first put them in. Here are some fresh wood scraps. So this is what they would have looked like when they first went in. So a lot of walnut here, a little bit of maple, padauk. So they just ended up darkening and not really composting at all. So that's actually pretty obvious in hindsight. So the point here is surface area matters. So if this was actually sawdust and not just big chunks of wood, it would compost a lot faster. I guess what this means for me is, for these size scraps, I guess I will probably just burn them in the future, because it just takes forever for them to compost in a compost pile. The same advice holds true for the food scraps, the fruit and veggie scraps that we put in there as well. So for example, if one of my children eats a pear or an apple and they just have the core left, that core itself is too large to compost effectively, really, and it ends up just being this big mushy blob after 3 or 4 months. So what I've learned is to take those food scraps and slice them up a few more times, creating more surface area, creating more opportunities for bacteria to decompose it. And again, it's just all about surface area. The more surface area you can expose to your browns and your grains, the more quickly your compost pile will actually compost. The final thing that I learned, and this was more of a moment of introspection for me, because I was throwing away fewer food scraps, so all the fruit and veggie scraps were no longer going and piling into my kitchen trash can. They were going outside into the compost bin. Because I was doing less of that, I actually had an interesting observation with my own trash can, which was that it just became full of plastic. And this isn't because I have been using more plastic in my life, but it's more of in the past, whenever you look at the trash can when you throw something away, I'm used to seeing a mixture of trash, and that's mostly composed of just plastic, paper, and food. And when you take away a lot of the food part of the trash can, you just get a pile of plastic, and that was an interesting observation, because I know it's a problem that we have as a society. I know it's a problem that I have, or that we have as a family, is we use too much plastic, too much single-use plastic. All this plastic just goes to the landfill. And so this is more of an observation for me to begin thinking about, how can I not be using so much plastic? I know that's kind of a weird takeaway from my first batch of compost, but it really was one month I was used to seeing a certain pattern within my trash can, and the next month suddenly it's just like, oh, there's just all single-use plastic. Why is there so much plastic in here? I'm not using any more plastic. It's just that it's just way more visible. So previously it was out of sight and out of mind. Anyway, maybe a little bit too preachy for this video, but it was an interesting observation nonetheless, and it really got me thinking about how we can reduce more waste in the future. And I think that's a healthy observation to have at this point. So yeah, overall, I think this was a great experience. This was my first batch of compost. I'm going to produce more batches because honestly, it's very little effort to save some sawdust, save some food scraps, throw them into a tumbler, rotate it a few times, and then walk away. Like, that's very minimal effort, not a big deal. And as a result, I get this really great, healthy, nutrient-rich compost that I can use for gardening, I can use for mulching and other purposes as well. So I am going to continue creating compost. I think it's a nice little side hobby to be doing here. And it's less wasteful as well, because I would just throw away these scraps and sawdust away anyway. So I'm glad I'm not being as wasteful anymore. I hope this was helpful for you all. My name's Charlie. I'm with Measure Twice Woodworking. Thanks for watching.